You know the cold, the kind that seeps into your bones and doesn't let go. Now imagine enduring that with nothing but straw, old cloth, and each other's breath. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? As you settle in for the night, let the past cradle your thoughts. In the long, dark months between the last harvest and the hopeful bloom of spring, warmth was not a convenience. It was a quiet struggle. The sun, when it came, was low in the sky, casting only a weak golden smear across frost-bitten fields. Most days it didn't come at all. Instead, the sky sagged with weighty gray clouds that pressed down on the land like a wet wool blanket. Villages lay silent under layers of mist and hoarfrost, chimneys sparse, and hearths few and far between. Many peasants, perhaps most, lived without the luxury of a fireplace. The cottages were small, their walls built of wattle and daub, wooden frames filled with woven branches and thick, sun-dried mud. When the wind howled through the trees, it found every gap in those walls. The cold came in without invitation, and it never seemed to leave. Inside, the floor was dirt, hardened and cool beneath foot-wrapped toes. Straw had been scattered across it in the autumn, once fresh, now trampled flat and sour with use. The scent of the straw mixed with the smells of cabbage stew, damp cloth, and earth. In some corners mice rustled, unnoticed, unbothered. At night families gathered close, pressing their backs to one another like bricks in a kiln, hoping to trap a bit of heat between them. Blankets were rare. Cloaks, tunics, and the woolen remains of the day's wear became the covers of the night. They layered what they had, a woolen shift, then another, an old hood repurposed into foot wraps, a sleeve stuffed with grass. Some tucked hot stones wrapped in cloth beneath their garments, pulled from the coals of a neighbor's fire, if the neighbor would share. Children often shared a single sleeping space, bundled beneath sheepskins, with only their noses peeking out, like little creatures in burrows. Their breath curled up in thin fogs, catching moonlight that slipped in through wooden shutters. No fire, but warmth, came in other ways. A mother sang softly while mending a seam by the dim orange glow of a tallow candle. The thread clicked through the linen, back and forth, steady and sure. Her voice was not loud, just a whisper, but it wrapped around the children like wool. An elder told stories, not the heroic kind, but gentle tales of geese and harvest spirits, of saints and foolish kings, always ending with someone full-bellied and warm, even if just in imagination. And when the wind moaned outside, the family didn't speak. They simply listened. The silence of listening was another kind of warmth. Hay was precious in winter. Much was needed for the animals. But if there was enough, a pile might be kept indoors, near the sleeping spot, fluffed up each night, dry and insulating, a soft nest in a hard world. Sometimes they slept near the animals themselves. The cow shed, though ripe with its own smells, radiated heat. The warmth of a cow was not a small gift. Her hide steamed in the cold air. Her steady breathing made the nights seem less endless. Chickens huddled in corners, and sometimes a pig or two. One body's warmth, shared, was worth more than a stack of firewood they did not have. Outside, the world froze in silence. Icicles hung from the eaves, wells crusted over. The sound of footsteps on the frozen path was crisp, sharp, and lonely. But inside, beneath patched roofs and humble beams, families learned to cradle the warmth they could create. A man might wake early, teeth chattering, and breathe on his fingers before reaching for his boots. He would stuff straw inside them, just to keep the cold from biting his soles as he stepped out. His breath bloomed in front of him like a ghost, and every exhale reminded him he was alive and still warm. They made gruel in the mornings, thick and salty, the pot suspended over a low ember if any coal remained from days past. More often it was boiled outside, once, then reheated over and over, the warmth thinner each time. Salted. Pork, when available, was kept near the ground. Butter wrapped in cloth. But the real fuel was movement. Spinning wool, chopping kindling, hauling water, scrubbing cloth, twisting twine. Hands always moving. Stillness was the enemy. So they moved, and when the sun disappeared too early, they sat in a ring, knees touching, the stillest parts of their lives only then beginning. Soft talk, gentle work, quiet laughter. As night returned, always too soon, they lay again in each other's arms, not for romance, not for comfort, but simply because bodies, close, gave the gift of heat. Sometimes the father would speak aloud in the dark, a half prayer, half promise, that spring would come, that the warmth would return, that they had made it through worse, and the family listened not just to him, but to the breath and heartbeat of all within reach. There were no roaring fireplaces, no flickering logs, no glowing hearths. There was breath. There were bodies. There was hope. And in the absence of fire, those things were enough. In the deeper countryside, far from manors and markets, peasants found other ways to trap warmth. Some built sleeping platforms above where the animals stayed. The rising heat, subtle as it was, drifted upward into the wooden boards and dried reeds that made the sleeping space. It wasn't comfort, it was survival, wrapped in simplicity. Mothers learned to tuck coals inside thick clay pots, if any embers could be spared. These pots were placed under the bed before sleep. They did not burn nor blaze, but gave off the faintest whisper of heat, like the final memory of a fire. When the morning came, the pots were still warm to the touch, and so were the feet above them. In some homes, window shutters were covered in linen soaked in tallow, or wax, then left to harden. These made a crude barrier, blocking out not only the cold air, but the drafts that whistled through the planks. Walls were stuffed with dried moss, the cracks between stones filled with bits of wool too ragged to use otherwise. Every scrap had its use, every thread, every sliver of cloth. A child's old tunic became a mitt for the father. A horse's worn-out blanket became a bedroll for the babe. Nothing was wasted. Everything held potential warmth. And though there were no chimneys in many of these cottages, smoke still played its part. A small, open fire, just a spark, fed with dried twigs, would be lit indoors. The smoke drifted slowly upward, darkening the thatch, staining the beams above, but in doing so it filled the air with a dense stillness. This smoke clung to the inside of the cottage, forming a slow, insulating layer. It was sharp on the tongue, bitter in the nose, but it trapped. Warmth like nothing else, so they lived with it, eyes stinging, breath shallow, but with warmth that lingered longer than the fire itself. The winter meals were warm only when first made. Soups of onion and root, thin but steaming, would sit at the center of the home. Everyone dipped from the same pot, hunched together, sleeves pulled over hands. Sometimes the eldest child would cup the bowl and hold it near their chest before handing it to the others, just to share a moment more of the heat. It was a ritual, brief, wordless, and it mattered. When there was no more soup, the bowl stayed in place, collecting the rising warmth from the earth below and the breath from those around it. The cottage was not warm, but in these rituals there was warmth enough. Winter became a kind of rhythm. Each day bled into the next with quiet sameness. Feeding animals, mending gear, stirring gruel, sweeping the straw. But this sameness had a slow comfort. Predictable. Familiar. Sometimes the youngest would sit beneath the bench, curled beside the dog, hiding from the chill that slipped in at ankle height. The dog would grumble softly, and they would press foreheads together, sharing steam and skin. Other days, the mother would tie warm stones into a bundle of cloth and tuck it under her shawl, letting her infant press against it while she spun. Wool near the door, her hands moving constantly, her breath rising in puffs. The door never fully closed. There were no hinges, just leather ties and weight. The wind still found its way in, but over the entrance hung a thick curtain made from stitched-together tunics. It billowed sometimes. Other times it froze stiff, but even frozen, it kept the breath inside. Some days they would hang dried herbs in the rafters, not only to preserve them, but because the scent gave a comfort beyond the physical. Lavender, sage, mint, when it could be had. These were not warm, not in the way fire was. But they offered something softer, a memory of sunlit fields, and memories, too, were a kind of warmth. The night was the true test, when the wind howled through the trees, when frost climbed the walls in thin silver fingers, when the straw crackled beneath the weight of sleep. The cottage would fall into stillness. Only the soft sounds of breathing remained. A cough here, a snore. The gentle rustle of cloth shifting against cloth. The moonlight painted pale lines across the walls, touching the faces of those who lay huddled beneath cloaks and skins, their eyes closed not against the dark, but against the cold. Yet, even in that cold, there was togetherness, and togetherness endured. Outside, the world hardened. The frost on the fences grew thicker with each passing night, curling into delicate patterns like white feathers etched in silence. Trees stood bare, their branches heavy with ice that clinked together faintly when the wind passed through. The rooster, usually so proud and early, would wait longer each day to call. He, too, felt the cold in his bones, and when he crowed, his breath rose in a plume that vanished almost as quickly as it came. The people stirred slowly. There was no reason to rush. Rising meant facing the cold again. A mother would wake first, always first. Her hands, already chapped and red, would search for her boots by touch. She wouldn't speak. She didn't need to. She'd pull her shawl tighter, lift the curtain that served as a door, and step out into the crisp breath of the world. The fire might be revived, or it might not. Some mornings were simply too still, too brittle. On those mornings the family stayed bundled longer, whispering beneath layers, toes tucked into thighs, arms wrapped around shoulders. The heat of each other, the only fire that would burn. Even the simplest warmth was remembered and guarded. A stone that had been warmed near a neighbor's hearth was passed from hand to hand before bed, like a gift. It had no flame, but it carried a history of it, and in that memory, fingers found comfort. When a villager lent their fire, it wasn't just heat they gave. It was trust. It was kindness. Sometimes a neighbor would offer the use of their oven once the bread had been baked. The lingering heat inside those stone walls was not wasted. Children would gather around the open door, giggling as they stretched their hands toward it, feeling warmth radiate from the belly of the beast that had fed them. Old women, knowing the value of that heat, would bring their woolen slippers or damp gloves to hang near the mouth of the oven. Not too close, never to scorch, just near enough to remember warmth. Fabrics, too, carried memory. A cloak passed from mother to daughter was never just cloth. It held years of winters. It smelled faintly of wood smoke, of time and sweat and ash. When worn, it wrapped not just the body, but the spirit, in something deeper than heat. Some wore belts lined with sheep's wool, tied tightly around their middles beneath their tunics. Others stuffed nettle fiber into their sleeves, and when those things wore thin, they were stitched again, never thrown away, only transformed. Evenings were the time of greatest care. Before the last of the light disappeared, candles were lit, if they could be spared. Tallow was precious. Each one burned slowly with a smell that clung to the air like wet wool. But their flickering offered more than light. They offered focus, a chance to gather close, finish the day's stitching or carving or turning of the wheel. A man might sit carving spoons. The shavings curled into his lap. His fingers stiffened quickly, so he would blow into them between strokes. His wife might twist flax, her eyes drooping, but her hands steady. A child might mend a toy, clumsy but determined. The work was not to pass time. It was to preserve warmth, of body, of spirit. The movement itself kept the chill from creeping too deep. Some nights, someone would tell a story, not always the same person, and not always for the children. These stories were not grand. They spoke of distant summers, of rain-soaked fields and the smell of bread, of the time the goat got loose in the churchyard, or the day the fire nearly caught the hay rack. But the telling and the listening, they stitched a fabric of their own, and in that fabric they were wrapped tight. There were songs, too, low and breathy, often hummed more than sung, songs with no words or words long forgotten. The melodies wove through the beams of the cottage, through the straw, through the dreams of those already dozing. They weren't sung to be remembered. They were sung to survive. Outside, the frost grew thicker on the windows, those who had windows. Ice formed in delicate spirals along the edges of wooden shutters. The wind pawed at the thatch, looking for a way in. But the warmth inside, though small, was stubborn, and so the cottage breathed, not loudly, not brightly, but deeply, a breath of hope, a breath of survival, a breath passed on from one sleeping soul to another. In the silence of the hours before dawn, the warmth dwindled. What little heat had been trapped in the hay and wool slowly slipped away, drawn out by the relentless fingers of the frost. The coals in the pot beneath the bedding faded to ash, and the night deepened, but no one stirred yet. They stayed close, layers pressed tight, the weight of sleep heavier than the cold. For a time, then quietly, the stirring began. A baby whimpered first, the soft cry muffled by cloth and closeness. A mother's hand, half asleep, reached to soothe, her palm rough from labor but warm with instinct. Beside her, the elder child shifted, wrapping arms more tightly around a sibling. No words were spoken. There were none needed, as the darkness began to lighten, not from sun but from the slow loss of night. Someone sat up, usually the father or the grandmother. They sat for a moment before standing, bare feet finding the cold earth floor, wincing, then steadying themselves. They would pull on layers, some stiff from frost, some still warm from sleep, and move toward the door. The curtain lifted. The sky beyond was pale blue, edged with white. The world outside crackled with cold, each branch coated in hoarfrost, each footprint from the day before now hardened into icy fossils. The cottage was left quiet. Those inside, still wrapped, would wait until the water had been fetched, until a little warmth had returned in the form of motion, fire, or food. Sometimes, if snow had fallen in the night, it would be scooped and placed in the iron pot, waiting for the slow melt. Water was water, even when it came frozen. There were days when the cold brought silence, no visitors, no news, just the same rhythm: mend, cook, feed, repair, gather, sweep, huddle. And yet, even in this there was quiet resilience. A child discovering a feather beneath the eaves, stroking it against their cheek. A man whittling a new spoon handle to replace the one that cracked in the chill. A woman humming an old tune while laying herbs to dry near the door. Little acts, small fires, each a defiance against the winter. One of the cleverest tricks was the use of body heat stored in stones. After boiling stones in the large cauldron, they were wrapped in cloth and placed in the bedding before nightfall. The stones would radiate heat for hours, soft, gentle heat. Children would pass them back and forth, giggling at the way the warmth surprised them, like a secret passed by hand. These stones would be reused night after night, becoming smoother over time, familiar. One might even be given a name, or kept, close like a doll. They were not toys, they were guardians of warmth. Sometimes, in the very heart of winter, villagers came together. They brought bits of meat, onions, or dry beans. A fire would be built in a shared space, perhaps an old barn or a chapel ruin, and a large pot suspended over it. Into it went everything, stirred with a long stick, boiled until it thickened. It was called pottage, and it was more than food. It was warmth you could taste, everyone shared, and after each person took a little warmth back to their cottage, whether in a full belly or in the glow of voices heard and faces seen. That glow lingered longer than any ember. And through it all the seasons turned. The snow melted slowly. The earth softened. The days stretched longer. And with each day, a little more warmth returned. First in the soil, then in the air, and finally in the hearts of those who had endured together. But even in the return of spring, the lessons of winter stayed. A thick curtain by the door, a hollowed stone for heating, a song sung not for performance but for peace. These were not forgotten. They were remembered, like prayers. The warmth of the medieval peasant was never taken for granted. It was made. It was shared. It was protected. Not with fires, but with presence. Not with roaring hearths, but with closeness, movement, memory, and love. And so it was year after year. Each winter brought with it the same quiet questions. Would the hay last? Would the roof hold? Would the shoes survive another month of mud and frost? And yet, within each cottage, the answers came slowly, in shared silences and practiced rituals. A shawl mended one more time. A pot boiled over again. A child gently wrapped in an old cloak, passed down through generations. There was never abundance, there was never certainty, but there was continuity. The animals, too, played their part. Cows, calm and slow-eyed, stood in their stalls, chewing with a rhythm that made the world feel steady. The warmth they gave off filled the barn like quiet breath. Sheep huddled together in thick knots of wool, their bodies pressed so close the steam rose from their backs. The chickens, fluffed and blinking, tucked heads beneath wings and dreamed, whatever chickens dream. Sometimes a young boy would sneak out at night, not to escape, but to press his cheek to the cow's side. Feeling the pulse of life in that deep, slow warmth, his fingers would clutch a bit of fur, his body folded into the straw. It was comfort, plain and honest, and in that stillness, with only the sound of chewing and the soft rustle of hay, warmth was something you could hear. Even laughter had a way of warming. Though it came less often in winter, when it did arrive, it filled the room like fire. A spilled bucket, a crooked seam, an accidental rhyme in an elder's tale. It didn't take much, just the spark of joy shared in the gloom. And when laughter came, heads leaned closer, shoulders pressed, eyes watered not just from smoke, but from joy. However small, it lit faces the way candles could not. And so they endured, without fireplaces, without stacks of logs, without glowing hearths to gather around. Instead, they gathered around each other. At the end of each day, the preparations repeated. Hands rubbed together, stone pots reheated, blankets adjusted, children nestled into arms, the cold pressed in, but they pressed back, not with strength, but with softness, not with fire, but with care. Outside, the world was vast and freezing. Inside, it was close, tight-knit, gentle, and though the cold remained, the warmth, slow, quiet, persistent, never left them entirely. And as you drift now into your own stillness, let the breath of those long-gone nights carry you. Let the closeness of bodies in the dark, the shared songs, the weight of wool and hay, remind you that warmth, even in its humblest form, is a story that lives on. Now imagine the rhythm of 1,000 such nights, not grand, not memorable to kings or scribes, but to the hearts that lived them, they were everything. Each night was a gentle struggle, a quiet bargain with the cold. In one home, a boy turned in his sleep and felt his sister's feet beside his own. In another, a widow pressed her back to the wall and whispered an old prayer, not to be heard, but to feel her breath moving in the silence. A mother stroked her child's hair and murmured nonsense rhymes passed down from her grandmother. The words didn't matter. The sound did. Overhead the thatch shifted slightly. Mice scampered unseen. The wind tested every beam, every board, but the people inside did not speak of fear. They had no need. The rituals, their ways of surviving, had been etched into the wood, the wool, the very breath of the place. There was no need to question what must be done. It was done. Night came, and night passed, and they stayed warm, without fire. When morning broke, it was slow, not with sun, but with light, gray first, then blue, then gold. If they were lucky, the world would crack open again, little by little. A twig snapped. A crow called. The snow hissed underfoot as someone stepped out into it. A child stirred and whispered, "Is it morning?" And someone, still tired, still curled, murmured back, "Not yet." But it was. Another day had come. This was the miracle. Not heat, but endurance. Not comfort, but care. Not flame, but faith. That the day would rise, that the earth would turn, that the cold would come and go, and that their warmth, quiet, fragile, real, would be enough. The past may seem far away now, but in the hush of your own room, as the night wraps gently around you, if you listen closely, you might hear it still. A breath, a rustle, the whisper of straw, the hush of wool shifting beneath a blanket, a foot brushing another in the dark, a lullaby humming low. the warmth, without fire, still glowing, in memory. And though time has pulled us forward, far from those cottages, from the straw beds and smoke-dimmed rafters, some things remain. The way we draw close on cold nights, the way we gather under shared blankets, the way a simple touch, a voice in the dark, a warm hand on a shoulder can make the world feel safe again. That hasn't changed. They may have lived without the fires we know, without chimneys or stoves or radiators, but they lived with one another, and sometimes that was more than enough. Think now of the father, sitting at the edge of the straw bed, quietly pulling on stiff leather boots, his breath forming little clouds in the morning dark. He doesn't complain. He doesn't sigh. He simply moves. The door creaks as he steps outside. The cold greets him instantly, sharp, clean, and biting. But his hands are already in motion, gathering wood, checking on the cow, brushing snow from the path. His body knows this routine, his heart too. Inside, the mother gently lifts the baby, holding it close against her chest, her own shawl wrapped around them both. She hums, not to sing, but to soothe, to let the warmth stay in the moment just a little longer. The older children shift beneath the sheepskins, unwilling to leave the warm nest of limbs and breath. Their eyes flutter, then close again. Just a few more minutes, until the day must begin. And while the sky brightens by degrees, the hearth remains dark. Still, the cottage is not empty of warmth. It lives in the hands that hold, in the feet that search for the last warm place in the straw, in the laughter that will return when the sun is higher, in the meals that will simmer slowly in the pot, in the stories that will be whispered again tonight. They stayed warm not with what they had, but with what they shared. And though no fire burned, a deeper warmth always glowed beneath the surface of their lives, a warmth built of repetition, of kindness, of knowing that someone would be there when the wind came calling. As your eyes begin to close, and your thoughts drift into the soft darkness of your own room, let their rhythm settle in your chest. Let the hush of the medieval night carry you. Let the quiet warmth of bodies, of memory, of soft sleep and steady breath gather gently around you as you rest. Somewhere in the folds of memory, older than parchment, deeper than ink, those nights continue. They are not bound to one cottage or one village. They stretch across time, through forest clearings, across frozen marshes, over low stone walls dusted in frost. The rhythm of the cold, and the answer of warmth. It plays again and again, not loudly, never loudly, but in the soft ways, in the drawn curtain, in the turned cloak, in the whispered song. In one cottage, a grandmother wraps her hands around a cup of broth, thin but steaming. Her fingers, bent and worn, cradle the heat as if it were light itself. In another, a young boy sleeps with a puppy curled beneath his chin. Their breath is shared, slow and even. The puppy dreams of running. The boy dreams of green fields that will one day return. In all of them, no fire, but still they are warm. Through the years, through the chill of seasons layered one upon the next, this knowledge stayed alive, a way of enduring, not through strength, but through presence. And if you listen, really listen, you might feel it too, in the still air of your room, in the hush between heartbeats, in the echo of silence just before sleep claims you. They are there, the old ones, not watching, but resting, wrapped in wool, lying on straw, breathing warmth into the night. And so, as the cold continues outside your own walls and the night deepens, allow their quiet courage to fill your chest, not as history, not as story, but as breath. Because warmth, real warmth, has always lived in the space between people, in the closeness, the stillness, the choice to remain near, even in the dark. Let your thoughts wander now, through the narrow lanes of that village, quiet under a dusting of snow, past the shuttered windows, past the leaning fences, past the well with its frozen bucket, rope stiff with ice. Listen, not for voices, but for the gentle rhythm of life preserved in the cold. A door creaks open. A hen clucks softly in the dark. A breath escapes into the air, silver and slow. This is the sound of warmth, without fire. A peasant girl, her cheeks red from the cold, wraps her arms around her brother as they watch the snow fall. She doesn't speak. Neither does he. Their shared silence is filled with understanding. A mother tucks the ends of a woolen wrap under her baby's feet, then rubs his back in circles. She hums the tune her own mother once hummed. The baby's breathing slows. Sleep wins. Nearby, a man tightens the knot on his belt and places a hot stone in a sack of oats just to warm the animal feed. It's not wasted effort. It's what keeps the creatures alive. Every action, every gesture is part of this unbroken ritual. This quiet battle, waged not with steel, but with wool, hands, breath, closeness, memory. Some homes used rushes dipped in animal fat for light. These rushlights flickered like thoughts, thin, trembling, determined. They gave no heat, only a little visibility, but that was enough. Under their dim glow, the day's weaving might continue, or prayers, or simple staring into the flame, thinking of things that might never be spoken aloud. Sometimes, nothing happened at all. And that, too, was survival. To sit still, to endure the moment, to wait. And while the night deepened, they slept, not because it was warm, but because it was time, because they must, because morning would come, even when it seemed impossible. Morning always came, and in that simple truth there was warmth. No fire needed, just time, togetherness, hope. That breathed as they did. Somewhere in the stillness of that world, a candle guttered. Its flame had lasted longer than expected, its tallow nearly gone. The little flicker leaned sideways, then righted itself again. Its glow painted soft gold across a wooden bowl and a folded cloth. One child stirred in the dim. He opened his eyes slowly, without fear, without rush. And in the hush of that moment, he watched dust float through the last of the candlelight. He didn't move. There was no need. He was warm. Enough. Wrapped in woven cloth, pressed against the sloped back of his older brother, he could feel the gentle rise and fall of breath, and beneath it, the subtle beat of a steady heart. It reminded him of something far away, but known. A lullaby made without words. Across the room, an elder snored softly, one arm tucked beneath her head, the other resting palm up in the straw, fingers relaxed, open, as if waiting to receive a memory. Her face, creased by years and smoke, bore a peace that only came with acceptance. She had seen more winters than anyone else in the house, and still here she was. Not untouched by the cold, no one was untouched, but she had learned how to live alongside it, like living next to a quiet river, one that never truly froze, but slowed, deepened. The wind outside rose and fell in waves. Sometimes it whistled through the gaps. Other times it pressed its body against the walls like a hungry beast, then gave up and moved on. But the cottage didn't mind. It breathed. The roof shifted slightly with each gust. The walls creaked gently as if in conversation with the wind. And beneath them, the people slept, or dreamed, or simply existed in the warmth of each other's presence. No words, no fire, just stillness. Sometimes, in the deepest part of night, someone would wake, not from fear but from habit. An old man might rise, not to stoke a hearth, but to check on a sleeping goat. He would pull on a stiff coat, wrap his arms around himself, and step into the darkness beyond the curtain. His boots would crunch softly in the frost outside. He would not carry a lantern. The moon was enough, and in that cold, under stars sharp as needles, he would smile, not widely, just enough, because he knew inside that small cottage, under straw and wool and breath and silence, was everything that mattered. He lingered outside a moment longer than he needed to. The barn door creaked under his hand, swollen slightly from frost. Inside, the animals stirred. Nothing startled, just the sound of life acknowledging life. The cow shifted her weight, exhaled a cloud of steam, then stood still again. The goat gave a brief huff through her nose and blinked in the dimness. He didn't speak. He just moved among them. One hand brushing along the cow's side, another gently patting the goat's shoulder. The straw beneath his feet was damp in places, frozen in others, but still it held the shape of warmth. He reached down to check the water pail. Still liquid, not yet frozen solid. That was good. He nodded to no one, as if the barn itself had earned his approval. Back in the cottage, a faint murmur rose, one of the children, half dreaming, turning over in the shared bedding. A foot pushed out into the open air, then quickly withdrew. A hand reached, found it, pulled it close. That too was warmth, not made of wood or spark or coal, but of instinct, of love practiced so often it no longer needed words. The man returned, quietly lifting the heavy curtain with care. Inside he paused, not because he was unsure where to step, he could walk this space blindfolded, but because the silence was beautiful. The slow, heavy breath of sleep, the faint crackle of a wall adjusting to the cold, the muffled echo of his own boots on the dirt floor. He took it in like someone taking in the smell of bread or the light of the first snow. Then he lay down again, pulling the thick, mended cloth up over his shoulders. Not because it made him warm, but because it kept his warmth close. He shifted his weight against the boy beside him, and without opening his eyes, the boy nestled closer. This was their fire. It flickered, not in a hearth, but in every gesture, every breath shared, every night survived. Out in the field beyond, a fox stepped lightly over the snow. Its coat glimmered under moonlight, silver and lean. It paused at the fence post, sniffed the air, and moved on. Even the wild things, they too endured the cold without flame. They too knew the ways of silence and stillness. The whole world seemed to pause that night, balance between shiver and sigh, between frost and forgiveness, between breath held in and breath let go. Inside, the candle had long since gone out, but the glow it left behind, on faces, on hands, on memory, still lingered. A girl, half awake now, blinked slowly into the dark. She didn't speak, She didn't move, but she listened. To the quiet, to the warmth, to the way her father's breath was slower than her brother's, to the creak of the wall above her head, to the sound of her own heart, steady and soft. She didn't know she was listening. She didn't need to, but later in life, when winters returned, when the air turned sharp again, and her fingers grew red from cold, she would remember this moment, not the straw, not the cold, but the closeness. In the far corner of the cottage, a bundle of rags slowly shifted. The family's dog, old now gray around the eyes, lifted its head, sniffed once, and resettled its chin on its paws. It had always known where to be. Near the door during the day, near the children at night. Its warmth was small, but it was constant. It had shared every winter with them, quietly, faithfully, without demand. Creature of the cold, who gave heat like a gift. The night stretched long, not because it was cruel, but because it had to be. That was the way of things. The cold was not a punishment. It simply was. And the warmth the people created was not defiance, but a kind of agreement. They would meet the cold halfway, not by pushing it away, but by holding tighter to one another. And in the spaces between breath and wind, between straw and skin, between silence and sleep, a kind of peace settled in, not loud, not fast, but deep. The kind of peace that holds through the night, and hums just beneath your dreams. Somewhere near the rafters, a beam creaked, gently, like an old voice sighing in its sleep. The house, though humble, had a presence. It had seen many winters, heard many whispers, cradled many lives. The thatch above had been patched year after year, stuffed with straw and reeds, daubed with mud and prayers. The walls carried the smoke of decades, and the warmth of every hand that had ever touched them. A home, not because of what it held, but because of what it preserved. And though they did not speak of it often, they knew the signs. A morning when the frost took longer to form, a breeze that didn't bite, a patch of mud showing beneath the melting snow, a crow calling from a distant tree. These were the whispers of change. The end of deep winter did not arrive all at once. It came in hints, small, almost invisible, shifts. But the people knew. They always knew. The eldest would notice first, a little less stiffness in the hands, a glimmer in the air before sunrise, a feeling in the bones that said, "Wait. It's not quite as cold as yesterday." She would not speak of it, but she would stand a little longer at the door. She would walk a little farther to fetch water, and when she came back inside, her eyes would hold a secret kind of knowing. For the children, it might be a moment when the straw didn't feel icy underfoot, or when the bucket of water still rippled, not frozen, in the morning light. Debaichi would laugh, and their laughter carried on the breath of warmer air sounded like birds returning, not loud, but hopeful. Always hopeful. The days remained cold, of course. The wind still pressed against the shutters. The stew still needed stirring. The blankets were still drawn high each night, but something had shifted. Something quiet and real, like a promise unfolding. And in those last weeks of winter, the warmth the peasants made for themselves felt different. Not desperate, not afraid, but earned. Built slowly, night after night, layer after layer, breath after breath. A kind of warmth that belonged to them, crafted not from flame but from living well together. Even as the frost clung stubbornly to the thatch and the well's edge still glazed with ice, Their movements softened. There was less urgency in the steps toward the woodpile, less tightness in the way shawls were drawn. The shoulders that once curled inwards now began to stretch again, ever so slightly. Life, once folded for warmth, began to unfold for spring. In the mornings, a little more light filtered through the cracks in the shutter. The smoke from the cooking fire drifted upward into air that felt thinner somehow, not warm, no, not yet, but lighter, and that lightness carried them. The mother, with her hair braided tighter now, began to hum while stirring the pot again. The father whistled softly under his breath while binding a cracked bucket. The children began to play again, their feet wet with thawing mud, their laughter echoing off stone and wood. But even in that new sound, the sound of change, there was still the memory of cold. They had lived with it, not as enemy but as teacher, and it had shown them how to endure, not alone, but together. So they did not rush to forget the long nights. They did not scorn the wool blankets or scatter the straw. They folded them, brushed them clean, and tucked them away, not as burdens, but as blessings, because they knew the cold would return, and when it did, they would be ready once more, not with riches, not with firewood, not with fireplaces grand and wide, but with arms that knew how to hold, with bodies that remembered how to gather, with voices that still knew the songs, that could cradle even the coldest hours. The spring would come, the fields would bloom, the fires would burn again in sun, not smoke, but in quiet corners of quiet cottages. The warmth of winter would never be forgotten. It had lived in them, and it would live again. And still, the nights remained cool. Spring was a guest that arrived slowly, pausing at the threshold, lingering in the treetops, waiting to be welcomed. There were days when the sun shone clear and bold, and others when the cold crept back as if it had forgotten something. So the people moved gently. They opened their shutters, but only halfway. They aired their blankets, but folded them again each evening. They smiled more often, but still gathered close as dusk fell. The memory of winter, though fading, was not gone, and in its shadow they cherished the warmth all the more. The elder woman, who had spent so many nights curled beside the fireless hearth, now sat at the doorway in the morning light, her hands resting in her lap, empty and content. She did not need to spin or stitch just now. She simply watched, as chickens scratched the thawing ground, as steam rose from buckets drawn fresh from the well, as the smallest child traced patterns in the dirt with a stick. The quiet was different now, not heavy, but gentle, and the warmth that filled the cottage was no longer just from breath or bodies, but from the slow return of the world itself. One evening the family ate their pottage outside, not far, just beyond the door. The air was still cool but not biting. The pot sat between them, resting on a flat stone warmed by the sun. They passed the ladle from hand to hand, sipped slowly, and let the air settle over their shoulders like a shawl of wind and light, and for the first time in many weeks they did not shiver. They simply sat. It was in these small moments, the ones not marked in ink or carved in wood, that life in the medieval world unfolded. No proclamations, no banners, just breath and touch and silence shared. These were the hearths they carried inside them, and when fire was not an option, this was what kept them alive. So as the stars began to rise again over that quiet village, and the wind shifted from sharp to soft, a peace settled in, not because the cold was gone, but because they had known it and come through it together. The seasons in that world didn't arrive with noise. They slipped in quietly, on the edges of mornings, beneath the call of birds, in the scent of the soil after thaw. There was no calendar hanging in the peasant's home, no marked day to declare that winter had ended. But they knew. They knew from the way the goat's coat no longer steamed in the morning chill, from the way the moss near the well had deepened in color, from the way the children's boots sank just a little deeper into softened earth. The cold hadn't left, but it had loosened its grip, and in that loosening they breathed easier. There was a ritual now, gentle, slow, of welcoming the warmth back. The men patched thatch roofs not because they leaked today, but because they would again one day. The women unfolded stored herbs, crumbling dried lavender between their fingers, letting its scent drift through the cottage again. It didn't smell like winter anymore. It smelled like air after rain. Children, always the first to return to motion, began to play farther from home. They followed the thawing stream past the last hedgerow, boots squelching, laughter echoing through still bare trees. They chased shadows again, not to escape the cold, but because the world was wide again. Their mothers watched from doorways, arms crossed, not in disapproval, but in quiet memory, because they too had once chased shadows barefoot and returned with frozen toes and glowing cheeks. In the fields beyond the village the land stirred. The soil, still sleepy, gave up its last frost like an old man stretching stiff limbs. The plow would return soon. Not yet, but soon. For now, there were fences to mend, buckets to seal, ropes to twist, and old tools to sharpen. Every task was done in the open, beneath gray-blue skies, with sleeves pushed up and shoulders relaxed. They worked more slowly than in high summer, but there was no urgency, only rhythm, the same rhythm that had carried them through the cold. Back in the cottage, the changes were subtle but constant. The straw on the floor was replaced. A fresh scattering, golden and clean. It scent like sunlit barns. The bedding was aired, each blanket lifted to the breeze as if to shake off the weight of winter's breath. The fire, if they had one, burned lower now, not from scarcity, but because the need was less. And in that quiet reduction, there was comfort. Meals, too, had shifted. The gruel remained. Simple, earthy, dependable. But now there were hints of green in the bowl. Wild garlic, nettles, tender shoots gathered by hand, each one stirred into the pot with reverence, not because it tasted rich, but because it meant change. A child wrinkled his nose at the bitterness. The mother smiled, tasting the future in every spoonful. At night they still huddled, but not so tightly. The heat of each body was no longer precious, only familiar. Now the closeness came from habit, from the comfort of a rhythm lived together, from the knowing that, even without fire, they had never truly been cold. Some evenings, when the sky held just a little more light than the night before, they would sit a moment longer outside. The father might rest on the low bench, worn smooth by years and seasons. A child leaning against his side, the dirt beneath, their feet still holding the day's warmth. They didn't speak much. The sounds around them, distant animal calls, creaking branches, the faint trickle of thawed water moving again, said enough. Conversation wasn't always needed in their world. Being present, breathing the same air, feeling the same wind, and was its own language, a full one. The elder woman sometimes sang at dusk, just a hum at first. Her voice was not strong anymore. It cracked at the edges, but it carried something deep, a sound older than the words, older even than the cottage. The children didn't always understand the meaning, but they leaned in when she sang. They felt it in their chests, like a heartbeat, not their own. and that was enough. Her hum wove through the wood smoke and the fading light, through the branches above and the grass below, until it became part of the evening itself. At night, with the shutters closed and the straw fresh beneath them, they lay back into the dim. The tallow candle burned lower than before, its stub saved, its light now a luxury. But no one minded the dark. They had learned to see in it, to know the outline of the rafters, to find each other's hands without searching, to speak in low voices that barely disturbed the hush. Sleep came gently. It wasn't chased or commanded. It arrived when it was ready, often while someone was mid-sentence or still chuckling at a remembered story. The children drifted first, their breathing softening into the rhythm of the house. Then the mother. Then the eldest daughter, who always tried to stay awake a little longer. Then the father, whose sigh marked the true closing of the day. And finally, the dog. One last shuffle, a long exhale, and the room stilled. Somewhere nearby, an owl called, its voice echoing through the trees like a distant bell. No one stirred. They had heard it before, many times, and they would hear it again. That, too, was part of the rhythm. The walls of the cottage, darkened by years of smoke and memory, held the warmth of the day deep in their bones. Not much, but enough. Enough to keep the night from swallowing them whole. Enough to remind them, each breath, each night, each season, that warmth is not just something you make with fire. It is something you share, something you remember, something you choose, even in silence. By mid-spring, the cottage no longer felt like a shelter from the cold, but a place that had quietly carried them through it. And still, they treated it gently. No doors were slammed. No boots were tossed aside. Every item, every space, every gesture still held the weight of winter's memory. The patched wall where the wind had once crept in was now sun-warmed. The worn bench by the door, once a spot to shake snow from cloaks, now held baskets of green things, freshly gathered. And in the far corner where straw had once been piled deep for warmth, a child sat cross-legged in the golden light, sorting dried beans by size, just for the pleasure of order. The world outside the cottage had softened too. The trees wore their pale new leaves like shy smiles. The birds returned, not in flocks but in pairs, each song thin and new, like voices unused all winter. And the fields, the fields, they opened again. Not grandly, not all at once, but with slow, patient breath. A furrow dug here, a patch of earth turned there, a scattering of seeds, dropped by hand, pressed in with thumbs. No tool buzzed, no metal clanged, just the quiet scrape of wood on soil. The occasional grunt of effort, and the pause, the reverent pause, after each row, as if the earth deserved a moment to receive. The village itself stirred like a sleeping body. Smoke still rose from some roofs. Old habits fade slowly. But more often now the cooking was done outside. Women knelt near stone circles, tending pots. Children chased chickens, laughing in rings of dust. Men mended carts and dug ditches. Their sleeves rolled high, their faces sun-browned again. It was a different kind of warmth now. Not hoarded, not begged for, but shared, easily, lightly, like passing bread from hand to hand. At night the closeness remained, not from necessity, but from love. They still curled into one another, not because the straw was cold, but because that's what they did. That's what warmth meant to them. Not heat, but proximity. The grandmother still sang, The father still woke before dawn. The mother still wrapped the smallest one in an extra cloth just in case the wind turned. And the walls, those quiet, listening walls, held it all. The laughter, the silence, the breath of those still living, and the echoes of those long gone. And when the children asked, "Will it be cold again?" the answer was never, "No." It was, "Yes, but not yet. And when it comes, we will be ready again." That readiness was not about strength, not in the way lords and knights measured it. It was a different kind, a softness that endured, a patience that did not bend. They had no armor, no stone halls, no great stores of timber or coal, but they had each other, and routines, and memory, and that was what made them strong. The children played beneath the budding trees now, picking up the smooth stones revealed by retreating snow. They drew patterns in the dirt with sticks, and sometimes with fingertips still pink from the cold. One of them, a girl with hair tied back in rough twine, built little homes of twigs and moss, arranging pebbles around them like tiny fire pits. She lit no fires, of course, but she leaned over them with care, as if the warmth might appear simply because she imagined it, and in her world it did. The animals stretched, too. The goats stepped lighter now, their hooves no longer sinking into frost. The chickens scratched, deeper into the softened ground. The cow stood longer outside the stall, turning her nose toward the wind, sniffing something older than scent. Even the dog had changed. It no longer curled in the deepest corner each night, but now took to the doorway, half in, half out, watching the breeze pass by like a familiar guest. Inside the home, the light had changed. What was once filtered and narrow in winter now fell in broad golden sheets across the walls. You could see the dust dancing in it, each mote a small, weightless thing gliding gently through the beams like old secrets. A boy watched them from his mat of straw, one eye open, one closed, his breathing slow. He reached out once, then let his hand fall again. Some things are better felt than caught. Even the meals changed, not in size. There was still little to spare, but in flavor. The nettles boiled soft, the leeks grown longer. The wild chives chopped into the stew. They added brightness, a kind of green warmth, not hot like fire, but vivid like waking. The family noticed, not with shouts or surprise, but with small nods, quiet smiles. Spoons scraped slower against the bowl. It tasted like movement, like forward. And when night fell again, earlier now, but with less weight, they gathered like always. They didn't need to huddle now. But they did, because warmth, once created, wasn't something to be forgotten. It was something to return to rebuild, to protect. Each night, every season, always. And so the days formed a quiet braid, each one looped gently through the next, held together not by drama or grand change, but by steady motion, by care repeated, by warmth preserved in simple acts. The roof was patched again, not because it leaked, but because someone remembered the year it did. A rope was retwisted, not because it broke, but because a frayed edge had once meant a dropped bucket in the well. A pot was mended, its crack sealed with care. Not because it couldn't be replaced, but because it was the pot. The same one used through every winter, its handle worn, smoothed by the same hands, the same meals, the same steam rising in soft curls toward the rafters. These things were not tasks. They were remembrances. They were acts of gratitude in motion. One afternoon the father sat beneath the trees near the field, his hands resting loosely in his lap, watching the wind ripple through the long grass. He wasn't resting. Not exactly. He was listening to the sound of the world continuing, to birds calling names no one had taught him, to the creak of the distant mill, to the small sounds of his own breathing. There was no work in that moment, no fire to tend, no rope to twist, just the warmth of sun on old skin and the memory of 1,000 cold mornings that made this quiet warmth feel holy. He thought of the winters, so many behind him now, and of the ones still ahead. He didn't dread them. He didn't fear the cold. He had known it too long. The cold was an old companion, stern but predictable. It asked something of you, and in return it gave you clarity. Clarity of need, clarity of worth, clarity of togetherness. What truly warmed a person had never changed, not in all his years. Later the child found him still sitting there, and without a word leaned against his side. The boy held something in his hand. A seed, still dirty, still cold. He didn't show it. He just held it, and the father looked down and smiled, not with his mouth, but in the way his shoulders eased. The warmth had passed again, without fire, without sound, without notice, just from one body to another, from one season to the next, and all around them the quiet world turned on. The light deepened, the branches whispered, the soil breathed, and the warmth remained. Years passed. The cottage weathered them all. Its wood darkened, its roof leaned, its floor bore the soft, uneven dents of countless footsteps. Children grew and took to the fields where their parents once turned soil with bare hands. The old woman whose songs once cradled the dark was remembered in silence, her voice now part of the rafters. The man who rose before dawn each winter day eventually rose no more. But his boots remained by the doorway, quiet and empty, still, dusted with straw. New voices filled the space, new breath warmed the walls. A different child curled into the blankets each night, wrapped not in fear of cold, but in the comfort of those who came before. And the lessons remained, that warmth does not come only from flame, that a body beside you is more powerful than a hearth alone, that straw, wool, breath, and kindness can hold off the longest night. Outside, the world kept spinning its great slow circles. Winters still came, wind still pressed at doors, frost still climbed the shutters in silver lace, but inside the warmth endured, quiet, handmade, and true. And long after the candles burned down, long after the last coals cooled, that warmth, shaped by countless hands in countless dark hours, remained, not as heat, but as memory. And in that memory, they were never truly cold again.